So, now that we've done those announcements, we can get on with tonight's program. How many people have been to Mount Washington before? I just took my 3-year-old son up the Cog Railway this past summer, and it's just amazing. It was like 85 degrees down below, 40 to 50 degrees up high, huge winds, rain, everything. It's an amazing experience. And this weekend is actually the last weekend of their season that you'll be able to go up. So maybe some last minute weekend plans. Mount Washington is all about bitter, cold, dense fog, heavy snow, and record winds. It's known worldwide for its unpredictable and dangerous weather. For a mountain its size, why is Mount Washington called the home of the world's worst weather? Tonight, Mount Washington Observatory's Will Broussard will guide us on an investigation into the unique life and work of weather observers stationed at the observatory year-round. We'll explore how the mountain's weather works and what it can tell us about New England's own weather patterns, all with stunning photography and video clips from the mount. So, is anybody having any trouble hearing tonight? No? Okay, so we'll get on with the program. Thank you so much, Will.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all. Once again, my name is Will Broussard. I'm very excited to be here tonight speaking to you about Mount Washington Observatory, coming off of a week of programming blitz. We have student groups that come to our center in North Conway Village, the Weather Discovery Center. It's kind of our public face of the organization because we are a unique nonprofit organization that exists in 2 places at once. We have a weather station, which you are all more or less familiar with, on the summit of Mount Washington, but we do have our offices in North Conway and a weather store and our exhibit hall in North Conway Village. So next time you're in the area, we encourage you to come visit us. We're open year-round in North Conway Village. But as Jessica mentioned, the season of visiting the summit of Mount Washington pretty much comes to a close on Sunday. The auto road will be probably closed tomorrow, as it was closed today, due to our strong nor'easter storm that we received, which came through like a lion last night, dumped a bunch of rain in the North Country, and gave us some incredible strong winds from the north and east and northeast. We actually peaked at 128 miles an hour on the rock pile this morning at 5:20 a.m. 128 is a lot of wind, but it's not the highest wind we've ever seen, so we'll talk about that. All right, show of hands, how many of you have set foot on the summit of Mount Washington? Okay, how many of you have taken your car up the Mount Washington Auto Road or driven with a van up the Auto Road? Okay, how many of you have hiked one of the many trails up to the top of the mountain? Okay, how many of you have taken the Cog Railway train? How many of you have spent the night on top of Mount Washington? Yeah, all right. How many of you have bicycled up the road? I ask because if I don't ask, there will be one of you in the audience that says, you forgot about me. And of course, I can't forget the runners up the Mount Washington running race. Yeah, awesome, congratulations. See, I knew I needed to include that. That's awesome. And so final question, how many of you are members of the Mount Washington Observatory? One, very nice. Oh, that's a very high average, that's great. So as the Educational Outreach Coordinator, it is my job to teach about weather and climate and the unique natural history of the Alpine Zone of Mount Washington. But I'm also here, as a member of the marketing and advancement team because we can't do the work we do without members. We are not part of the United States government, although we do receive some funding from National Weather Service. So it's really important to consider membership if that's something that you'd like to do. If this talk is of interest to you, if you want to join us, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Let's see, would it be possible to get perhaps the front lights down a little bit? Okay. To talk a little bit about our facts about Mount Washington. Everyone see that all right? Beautiful, bold colors. It is 6,288 feet tall. It is the tallest mountain east of the Black Hills of South Dakota and north of North Carolina. So you do have to go pretty far in every direction to find a taller mountain peak. And that does play into why we have such extreme weather, being the highest peak in the Northeast. It has a subarctic climate. So being on Mount Washington, you find yourself in the Alpine Zone, reminding yourself of the Alps of Europe. You reach Alpine Zone when you hit about 4,500 feet in elevation, the lowest tree line in the United States. Incredible strong winds and icing events keep that tree line relatively low. So it's pretty incredible when you're walking up usually a 5-hour hike up Mount Washington. You're moving into an environment that's akin to driving 600 miles north into Canada and beyond. So being on Mount Washington is like being in an Arctic island, separate from the rest of the environment that you'd find further north in Canada. So really incredible change in the landscape as you go up the 7.5-mile Otter Road or 5.5-mile Cog Railway. The mountain itself, geologists love this mountain. Its rocks are upwards of 400 million years old. Incredible history of heat and pressure in the geological time scale. For those of us interested in the human history, of course, the Abenaki people lived here before many of our ancestors did. They called Mount Washington a Geokachuk, which means dwelling place of the gods. Respected and possibly also feared for its incredible strong winds and incredible quick changes in weather in a short amount of time. But for those of us interested in the European history of this mountain, 1642 is the year that Darby Field, a native of Durham, New Hampshire, born in Ireland, hiked this mountain. So we have been coming to the summit ever since through all the modes of transportation that is possible to get up to this mountain. I'd like to say this is what Mount Washington looks like right now, but not quite. This mountain does retain much of its snowfall in certain sheltered pockets well into June and July. This year was the second week in August when the last snow melted out of Tuckerman's Ravine, and those crazy people with their skis tried to do a couple jump ski turns in early August. Kudos to them, to say that they got to ski in August in New Hampshire. Pretty incredible. But you see in this photo here, Mount Washington Otter Road snaking up to the summit right there, and we're looking east-southeast towards the coast of Maine. Notice these two beautiful ravines here. Huntington, the northern ravine, Tuckerman's, the southern ravine, world-famous rock and ice climbing, and of course Tuckerman's has that beautiful spring snowpack, often up to 100 feet deep in locations in springtime. Many names of places up here, really fascinating history. Mount Washington, for those of us interested in the trivia, named for General George Washington before he became our first president. Tuckerman's Ravine, named for a lichenologist who worked at UMass Amherst, Edward Tuckerman, and Huntington, named for the first meteorologist on the summit in the 1870s. So really rich history of exploration. And once again, we have our Alpine Zone, a really beautiful meadow-type landscape full of boulders, lots of plants that have this beautiful burnt red color in the fall. Of course, our autumn begins in mid-August on Mount Washington and slowly moves down the summit until it hits southern New Hampshire and here in early October. So quite a long, fun story to watch as the autumn changes through New England. I said tree line, 4,500 feet. These forests that are growing there, they're old growth, 100-plus-year-old trees that are growing a foot off the ground. Really slowly, really gnarled looking. This we call Krummholz, which is German for twisted or crooked wood. It is slow growing over, decades against a constant barrage of high winds and icing events that we get that sandblast these trees and really work at their character. It's really quite interesting. Rock piles, mini rock piles, we call cairns, mark the way. Many of the oldest hiking trails in the United States are in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and Mount Washington is no exception, with many old hiking trails. These cairns help us navigate our way through the Alpine Zone. What you're not seeing in this photo is the incredible amount of summit fog that we get 2/3 out of the year pretty much. We are inside of a cloud. You can't see your hand in front of your face at times, and that can be very disorienting. So our rock piles help us navigate our way through. Autoroad. Most people know the summit through driving the Mount Washington Autoroad, either through your own attempt at white knuckling it up this road, or maybe you got a van ride through one of the stages at the Autoroad. This is America's oldest man-made attraction, built in 1861 as a carriage trail. So it took a team of 6 horses to bring your carriage up in about 3 hours. Nowadays, you can take your car up in about 45 minutes. There's no posted speed limit, but you'll probably end up coming upon someone very quickly that's going much slower than you are as they're heading up this mountain. It is wide enough for 2 cars to pass each other safely, but you get to know your car's width pretty quickly on this road. We close this road every couple of years for an automobile race to see how fast you can get your car up the Mount Washington Autoroad. Begun in the early 1900s, this is a world-renowned automobile race. So who wants to take a guess as to the current record set 2 summers ago by a gentleman from the Vermont Rally Car Company driving a Subaru WRX at up to 130 miles an hour up the Mount Washington Autoroad? 8 minutes is a great guess. Lower than that? Okay, I heard between 5 and 6. 5 minutes, 43 seconds is the current record up the Mount Washington Autoroad, held by Travis Pastrana, world famous rally car driver. And he loves this mountain. He's a little crazy to do it, but if you don't believe me, there's a great YouTube video shot from inside his car as he drove the Mount Washington climb to the clouds. So really fun. Equally storied mode of transportation, the Mount Washington Cog Railway, built in 1869, the country's first mountain climbing train. And about half the track that we have the road for Autoroad, this goes right up the side of Mount Washington. A really spectacular view on a clear day. On a cloudy day, well, it's a little hard to say because you're not seeing a whole lot when you're going up the road or the cog in the middle of the clouds, but sometimes it's better that way, so you don't get to see how far down you can see. So, brings us up to speed, Mount Washington Observatory. We don't own anything at the summit of Mount Washington. We rent our space from the state of New Hampshire. Being a nonprofit, unique in that respect, we only are really owning the data that we collect every hour of every day, going back 87 years to our founding in 1932. So we are a nonprofit registered as such, and we observe the weather every hour of every day. Someone is going outside to take a manual weather observation. That means they're using their eyes, they're using instrumentation, they're using their experience to gather weather information. We also educate the public about, well, safety in the Alpine Zone, creating our twice daily forecasts for 48-hour outlook for the summit of Mount Washington. And we're also providing a unique backyard Arctic research facility for all kinds of products, which we'll talk about. So someone's going outside every hour of every day looking at things like temperature. It can get cold on Mount Washington. It can get cold all year round. As other folks have mentioned, it can be 90 degrees in North Conway and 50 degrees on top of Mount Washington. I once brought a group of middle school students up on a sunny late May day a few years back. It was 65 in North Conway. It was 25 on Mount Washington and a whiteout blizzard. Needless to say, all those kids bought all of our hoodies out of the gift shop on the summit. But it can change very rapidly, just like that. We can also be rivaling the coldest reporting stations in the world. There's this great website, weathernow.com, and you can see the rankings where you are. And back a couple years ago, we were at 36 below with a 92-mile-an-hour wind, rivaling northern Canada and Russia for the coldest reporting station on the planet for that particular instance, which is pretty cool. But it's not all cold all the time. A couple years ago, we had 2 rapid warm-up events where we actually, in this case, hit 48 degrees on February 21st. That tied our all-time record high temperature for winter. Pretty incredible. 2019 wasn't so warm in terms of our winter, but it was a windy winter last year. We had a higher average wind speed than we typically do by, actually about 5 to 10 miles an hour, which doesn't seem like much, but when I talk to you later about what happened in February of last year, you'll know why the average was kicked up a little bit. And I should say, these guys and girls are wearing goggles because the winds are about 100 miles an hour in this photo, but they are wearing their t-shirts because February 21st, 48 degrees feels downright tropical. So they were pretty comfortable in their t-shirts, but not so comfortable with their eyes exposed to the wind. So the average temperature on Mount Washington, 27 degrees. Below freezing, so that's interesting. It's below freezing on average more often than it is above freezing. So we are classified in that sense, the subarctic classification. The warmest it's ever been, 72, twice in our history. Coldest, 47 below, which is also a state record for New Hampshire. Every 6 hours, as more or less mandated by the National Weather Service, we go outside and we collect our precipitation can. It's a 3-foot deep metal can that sits out in the middle of our parking lot. Looks kind of like a trash can, but that's why we mark it off so that hikers don't think that. But sometimes little pieces get in and out. But we're going out there, it's one of the more dangerous jobs that we have to do, but we need to know, as best as we can, how much snow and rain and other precip actually falls from the sky. So it actually sits inside this specially designed screen that actually allows wind to slow down just enough as it's passing over the summit to drop out moisture. If we can't really tell whether or not it's snowing or if it's blowing up from below, we actually have a piece of cardboard that we've wrapped black felt around, which we will hold into the wind, and we actually capture snowflakes on it. I'll show you in a little bit a short movie of what that entails, but we can actually tell the difference between blowing snow and falling snow, and which is quite hard in 100-mile-an-hour winds to tell the difference, unless you're holding this board out. So talking about precipitation, we usually get about 300 inches of snowfall. Last year we were above average. We were about 350 inches of snow. The most snow we ever got was 47 feet of snow in the winter of 1969. Incredible year, and they say that the ravines never melted out that fall, which is pretty interesting. So, much like an airport, we're also measuring visibility from our summit. And most of the year we're inside of a cloud, as I said, but when it's clear we can see up to 130 miles. So looking to the west, we use locations in upstate New York, the tallest peaks in the Adirondacks, to tell us how far away we can see. To our southeast, about 67 miles away, we see the Atlantic Ocean. We often see it only in the morning when the sun is at the right distance above the horizon, so that we can actually get a golden glow on the horizon. It's incredible. But once the sun gets up a bit higher, that coastline kind of blends in with the horizon at that point. But we'll often be able to see ships coming out of Portland Harbor, which is pretty cool. If you use binoculars, you can see that anyway. And that is Sebago Lake in Maine in the foreground. But most of the year, white sheet of paper inside the ping pong ball, this is what we get. And this is basically our view outside on our observation deck. These are about 1 foot by 1 foot tiles that we help use to kind of make that distance verification. So we'll then, if it's really, really foggy, we'll have to cut up, instead of miles, we'll be cutting up into fractions of mile to report to our database and to National Weather Service. Something that is very unique about Mount Washington, when we are inside of a cloud and we are below freezing, we start to accumulate rime ice. That's R-I-M-E. And that looks like this. So this is very beautiful. It is a hallmark of alpine zones all over the world. It's essentially frozen cloud. So as a cloud passes over the summit, technically the little water droplets inside of that cloud they're above freezing, even if the temperature is down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also C. 40 C equals 40 F. But interestingly enough, even though it's technically freezing, those liquid water droplets stay liquid. They're floating around. They have nothing to attach themselves to. But if they collide with a solid object, they start to grow these feathers of ice. We can receive 3 to 5 feet of this stuff in just 7 hours of the ripe, rhyming conditions. I did not plan on saying that. But this is our job security. We have to battle this stuff. It's beautiful, it's delicate, it's fun to look at and take photos of, but we have to go outside sometimes 10 times an hour with a crowbar or a hammer or a mallet, and we release this ice by hitting the bases of the wind instruments that they're attached to. And it sends a vibration into them, which releases the ice. So we'll show you what that entails in my video towards the end of the program. To get around some of this icing, we invented our own wind speed measuring device back in the 1940s. This is a pitot tube-based anemometer system. The pitot tube you would see on an aircraft. It tells the pilot how fast the plane is going. You either see it on the nose or under the wing. But back in the 40s, we were able to basically fuse it with a wind vane, and we actually have it up on a post. It has heat tape wrapped around it. It has internal heaters. We can adjust the heat depending on how cold it is. And this is mostly clear of Rime Ice. But as you can see, there's paint chipped all the way up to the top of the post because we need to get to that where the Rime Ice starts to grow. We need to get rid of it. Even if Rime Ice is growing out a foot here, that can influence negatively our wind information and wind data. So we want to make sure this is clean for our database and for our records. Wind. Mount Washington is world famous for its winds with an average annual wind speed of 35 miles an hour. This is the windiest location in the United States. Winds of 35 really don't sound like a lot, but if you take your weight and divide it in half, that number in miles an hour is enough to make walking difficult. For most people, it doesn't take much wind to start to knock you around. So when you look at our highest wind, 231 miles an hour, which we recorded April 12, 1934, that was absolutely enough to knock you around. Our weather observers were safely inside a essentially one-room schoolhouse, which was bolted down to the summit with several chains that went over the roof of that building. And they got to experience that windstorm. That windstorm survived for many decades as the highest wind directly observed by mankind until 1996, when a higher wind was recorded off of Western Australia, 253, associated with Cyclone Olivia. So we like to say still highest wind directly observed by people because the Australians had to evacuate their weather station. So we still get flack from the Australians over that. So we have a plaque that commemorates that event on the summit, which we put up every summer. So it's nice to go up there and be there and look at it and think about it. And we just celebrated a big milestone just this last spring. We got some of the children of our founders who got to experience the big wind, came in for our own April 12th, 2019 experience of thinking about what it was like to be up there. And we talked all about calibration of that instrument. There's a myth that our instruments blew away in the storm. That didn't happen. We have that same instrument in our museum on the summit of Mount Washington. And those instruments that measured those winds were actually tested in wind tunnels at MIT and elsewhere, so we know for a fact that that wind was a true wind speed, which is pretty incredible. If you think about a hurricane of Category 5, 155 mile an hour winds. So 231 is way beyond that. We're not saying that a higher wind was probably observed inside of the eye wall of a powerful typhoon or hurricane in the last 10 years. Highly likely, if you think about some of those big storms we've gotten, but unfortunately, we don't have the records verified for those high winds, but we do for Australia and Mount Washington. Why are we so windy? The million-dollar question. It comes down to our geography. The White Mountains, being in north central New Hampshire, they act like a boulder in the airstream. Air that's flowing in from the west, our dominant wind direction, gets forced up and over these White Mountains and actually have to rise 4,700 feet of elevation before they then can spill out the eastern side. As they're doing that, they're coming up and over. They are physically being squeezed by a constriction. That constriction is the tops of these mountains and an area 30,000 feet above our heads called the tropopause. All of us humans, we live in the troposphere, the lowest level of the Earth's atmosphere. But up there, the tropopause acts like a lid, a thumb over the garden hose, as we say, to accelerate that air through the constriction due to Bernoulli's principle or the Venturi effect. So we are just so windy, a 30-mile-an-hour wind at the base, like this morning, becomes a 130-mile-an-hour wind on top of Mount Washington. It's just that simple. Finally, storm tracks. We are affectionately known as the tailpipe of the United States. We get the rest of the country's weather. Every 2 to 3 days, a low pressure will track over or near New England and give us some sort of impact. A storm doesn't need to go right over Mount Washington for us to feel its effects. Superstorm Sandy made landfall in 2012, 400 miles south of Mount Washington. But we recorded the highest wind with that storm, 140 miles an hour. So we can feel effects from storms much further afield, which is very interesting. And it also explains why Boston radio stations and news stations call us when they're getting some kind of snow event. They must be, Mount Washington must be getting something crazy. It's not always like that. But it is interesting how we don't start getting skiers up in the White Mountains until it snows in Boston. It's snowing in New Hampshire for, a few weeks before it snows in Boston, but it's interesting how that happens. So that's us. To see the wind, of course, wind is invisible, but we can see its effects, and we can see its influences on our landscape, and we see what happens when we put it on paper. We use small paper charts that sit in our office. They rotate slowly over 24 hours, changed out at midnight. They're called Haze wind charts. This is an example, February 16th, 2015. A sad day for us. We actually had air temperatures of 35 below zero for 48 hours. And we had winds to 120, peaking at 141 around 6 a.m. And a woman lost her life on nearby Mount Adams on this day, memorialized in a book called Where You'll Find Me by a local area writer. I speak about this because we're at a library, and this is a book about basically the missteps this person, this very she was not world-renowned, but she had been all over the world hiking and mountaineering, and sadly lost her life on this relatively small mountain range in New Hampshire. So all the steps that she took and the missteps are outlined in this book, and many of our staff were interviewed as a kind of a forensic analysis of the meteorology behind this storm event and what led to this person's demise. So Where You'll Find Me by author Ty Gagne, if you're interested. But as you can see, winds through the day, they are basically placed on this chart through a small pen that's going back and forth, back and forth. The thicker that red line is, the more gusty those winds are. It's kind of like walking into a stream that has a very kind of steady flow. You can kind of get into it and walk across no problem, versus going out into the ocean and having waves hit you and knock you over. Gustiness of wind on Mount Washington is really dangerous. You think you know what you're doing, you think you've got yourself braced for it, but then it drops, and then you kind of let your guard down, and then it ramps back up and throws you the other direction. Of course, these straight line winds on Mount Washington, as a lot of children ask, well, does it pick you up and take you away? Well, not quite. Not a rotating tornadic wind. This is a straight line wind, which literally just knocks you over and drags you until you hit a rock or the side of a building. It's quite dangerous and painful if you get knocked by the wind. But if it is steady, like it is from time to time, you can get into a 100-mile-an-hour wind and lean into it. You can lay at 45 degrees into those winds, and it will hold you up. You can sit down, and it will hold you up. It's incredible feeling. You'll also feel muscles that you've never even known you had when you're walking through it. It's kind of like swimming. It's really quite intense and otherworldly. So we create a 48-hour higher summits outlook specifically for Mount Washington and its Alpine Zone for all of those hikers and all of those recreationalists in the White Mountains. We see about actually 150 to 200,000 visitors every summer season, and an additional 50,000 visitors through the winter just hiking. So we have a lot of folks coming through, recreating and using our products. So this is free for use off our website. We do daily calls to various radio stations and TV stations in the Mount Washington Valley, along with all of the Alpine hut hotels that the Appalachian Mountain Club runs. So we do our morning weather forecast so that everyone at those places knows what to expect. Probably the most unique way to get to work. Every Wednesday, we take a snow tractor up the Mount Washington Auto Road, top speed 8 miles an hour, which means that we get up on a good day in 2 hours, but it can take us 6 hours to go one way because this thing has to barrel through big snow drifts. Talking about 45 to 90 degree angle concrete snow that we need to bust through. Because if we don't do it, no one's going to do it, and we just need to take the time. So our staff get up there on Wednesdays. We bring a fresh grocery order every Wednesday, and we do a bulk food, dry good order every month. They say we have enough food to last 3 months if we need to. New Hampshire Public Radio just came up and decided that Mount Washington was the place to live out a zombie apocalypse should one happen. Yes, they did actually do a program on that. So it's just another worldly place. Research, we work with a number of organizations. Boston Dynamics had a number of their robots up, studying the effects of the atmospheric pressure on the engines of these vehicles. We're at 20% less atmosphere on Mount Washington. It's enough to make you notice when you're going up and down the staircases, but it's not deadly. You don't need supplemental oxygen like you would on much taller mountains. Back in the 1940s and 50s, we were a proving ground for jet engine components, jet wing components. So we were working with the Air Force back then and had our whole hangars open to the northwest, and we would put basically components of aircraft out, and you'd get doused with ice, and then engineers for various corporations would go to work and see what could be used to get that ice off of those planes. So much of the de-icing technology we have today and take for granted was honed, if not invented, on Mount Washington over the last 70 years, which is pretty incredible. Things you wouldn't think of, we partnered with Keurig of Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, and they actually brought their Keurigs up and they were testing the lower atmospheric pressure, and they discovered that at 6,000 feet, the little K-cups would blow up. So they had to adjust their pressure settings for their higher altitude markets, which is pretty incredible. And we got a couple of Keurigs out of that deal, which was nice. And of course, can't not talk about Marty. Marty is our summit mascot. He's a Maine Coon cat. He's been with us for 11 years on the summit. He's our buddy. He keeps the Night Observer company. I'll tell you, this is the one time he wore his Eastern Mountain Sports jacket. So we do have a clothing sponsor with Eastern Mountain Sports, and they did give him a jacket, which was really nice. I heard the intern got a little clawed up out there that day. So we do get struck by lightning several times a year. This is one of those red lines. We do not go outside. We actually have a voltage meter in our office, which tells us when lightning is about to strike, but it does make for an interesting photograph when you can get one. Different cloud types. These are lenticular clouds. They grow above and downwind of mountain ranges all over the world. They're basically the visible portion of an invisible sine wave over and above the mountain, downwind of the mountain as those winds move up and over. Usually start to get them ahead of cold fronts, and maybe even as the weather is moving out of the area, any lingering moisture gets to be condensed out in the form of these pancakes or UFO clouds. We see undercast, where clouds come up to the level of the mountains but stop before they actually come and envelop us. So it looks like an ocean in the sky, which is pretty cool. If you were down in North Conway, this would be called an overcast. So we call it an undercast from the summit of Mount Washington. If we're very lucky, we get to see the aurora borealis. We get some great views of the night sky from the summit, but we are inside of a cloud every other day, so it's hard to predict when we'll get something like this, but it's worth it when we do. And my last photo here, one of the great hikes coming down from the summit of Mount Washington to Lakes of the Clouds, a little natural freshwater, couple freshwater ponds that sit adjacent to the Appalachian Mountain Club hut of the same name. So about 2 miles off the summit, a great little walk. So with that, I'd love to show you a short video of what it's like to do some of our night observations. So in this video, you'll be meeting Ryan Knapp. He's a veteran weather observer, been with us 13 years. And he takes the greatest photos. If you follow us on social media, you will see his stuff. But he's going out, and he will be followed along with a videographer, a local Boston videographer named Tom Gomet, who back in 2012, when we made this video, was creating a project that would become incorporated into our museum at the summit, which we installed in 2014. But he got some great raw footage, and we put it together into this short video for y'all.
About to head outside. Temperatures are in the negative single digits, around 5 below. Winds are about 80 miles per hour, gusting up to 90, almost near 100. Should be a lot of blowing snow. Still have a lot of upslope flow going on. Trying to make sure I don't have any exposed skin since wind chills are about 40 to 50 below right now. So it would only take a few minutes to start feeling the effects of frostbite out there. This is called a snowboard. It's not what you'd find at a ski resort or anything like that. Real simple piece of technology, just a 1 foot by 1 foot square piece of plywood with a piece of black felt wrapped around it. What this allows us to do is hold it into the wind, and it catches snowflakes against it, and we can examine the flakes to see if they're whole or sheared off. If they're whole, it means that it's still snowing. If they're sheared off, it means blowing snow, because the interaction of the flakes breaks them apart. So we'll take that outside. Now what we have to do is put this into the wind to see what we can catch. Right here where I'm standing, there isn't a lot of wind because we're in the lee of the building, or at least of the tower. So there isn't a whole lot of wind here, but where we're gonna walk is over onto the edge of the deck to try and pick up what we can that's blowing over the deck on the corner there, where winds are still about 80 or 90 miles per hour. Really have to hold your footing, watch where you're going so you don't trip on any rime ice that might be on the ground, and also just watch your head to make sure nothing's flying up and over the edge. Don't really see anything right now, so we'll just securely hold on to the snowboard as best we can and see what we can catch. Now you really have to lean into it to try and get what you can. You can see airflow streaming off of the board as it creates a nice little wave type action up and around it. And because it's so cold and so dry out right now, you get little tiny flakes on the board. It's hard to distinguish whether or not they're whole flakes or not whole flakes, but looking at radar before coming out, there's definitely an upslope event going on, and you can still see a little tiny flakes on the board. We'll head back into the safety of the lee of the building to just double check the board to make sure that there is something there. And even in the short time I was out there, you can see rime ice forming on my gloves. My cheeks hurt where it's exposed to the wind because the wind chill is about 40 to 50 below right now. So it doesn't take long to feel the redness in your skin anywhere that it's exposed. The back of my neck is also very numb and very cold feeling right now because of the airflow. Since we're in the fog tonight, we have a lot of rime ice forming, but that also means that we don't have to do any slinging. We just grab our temperature off of what's called the thermo shack here. Thermometer's hanging up inside. We just kind of lean in real quick to grab the temperature, and right now it's reading 5.4, 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. So when you factor that temperature in with the 80 to 90 mile per hour winds, you get those 40 to 50 below wind chills out here. So very cold night for December. The winds tonight were 80 to 100 miles per hour with gusts well over that, and we have to go up once an hour to de-ice the instruments because what they get on them is called rime ice. So when we're in the fog, it's actually super cooled, which means it's still in a liquid phase until it hits a surface, and then all of a sudden it freezes instantly and creates these long feathers of rime. It might look pretty to the observer that's just visiting here, but to instrumentation like that, it actually gums up the working mechanisms of them. So we have to go up once an hour with a crowbar and de-ice them just by hitting the base of the poles that they're on, which vibrates enough to knock off the Rime Ice. And when it's this cold like it is, it doesn't take much to actually knock it off. Anytime winds are high like this, you don't really want to spend a lot of time messing around up there. You basically want to get up there, smack what you need to get off, and then just get down as quickly as possible. The faster you can get it done, the less strain it is on your body, the more reassuring that you're going to get in safely. All right, heading out to get the Precip Can. A lot of people often ask me what the most scariest part of my job is, and this is probably one of them. The main reason being because I have to fight the elements and everybody's asleep at night, so I really don't have anybody waiting for me if I don't make it back. Now, if winds were high, I'd more than likely wake somebody up to be waiting by the door. But on a night like tonight, where winds are blowing about 90 miles per hour and only gusting to 100, albeit it's strong, but it's not too dangerous for myself. I've been out in these plenty of times. Now right now we have a northwesterly wind, so we're kind of in the lee of the building, so it's not too bad. But once we get to the end here, we'll feel the full brunt of the winds and slowly make our way out to the Precip Can, which is in the center of the summit here. And around this corner, this is usually where it's the strongest. Getting out to the Precip Can is not the difficult part. It's once you make the slop, you have to keep the can upright. On an ideal day, just pull out, put it in the holders here, put the new one in, grab the one you just took out. Staying low. And again, try to keep the can as upright as possible. If it comes down to it, it's best just to fall down on your butt and keep the can upright. And then getting your footing on the ice. Large chunks of ice blowing at you. It's going to be a little bit difficult. Once you get back in the lee of the building, it's not as bad. You can slowly make your way back to the front entrance, just trying to see where the light is. A lot of snow gets billowed off the top of the building here, which can create whiteout conditions at times, making it really difficult just to see the hand in front of your face.
Okay. All right, so we've reached that time. I'd love to take any questions you might have about what we're up to on Mount Washington, including how crazy is Ryan? And the one question we do get a lot of is, why don't we use tethers up there? Well, tethers would be much more dangerous for us. If we were to get wrapped up in a rope or something, some kind of harness, that would make the situation much more dangerous much more quickly. As Ryan said, he'd keep another observer at the door or radio with an observer in the bedrooms if he needs to. And if winds are too strong, he just won't go outside. He'll skip that observation. We don't want to put ourselves at risk for that one observation. And we'll delay it an hour or two if we need to. He'll also be wearing traction on his feet so he can grip into the snow and ice as he goes. The cutoff, it's going to vary by person. For someone like Ryan with more experience, it might be 110 sustained, but it's getting close. For the most part, most of us won't go out in basically 105 or so. My personal record's 108 being outside in. It's interesting. Last winter, so February of this year, I was up with an educational overnight. One thing that we provide are educational programs, 6 of them through the winter season with varied themes educationally through the winter. We also have day trips where we take our snowcat up and down and learn more about what we do. But this particular overnight was a Saturday into Sunday that I was going with an educational leader. He was leading on the subject of mountaineering, and I was the observatory liaison. So we were going up on a Saturday. We were supposed to come down on Sunday. We didn't come down until the following Wednesday because a strong storm had come into the region. It was February 25th, and we had incredibly strong winds from the south on I believe it was Sunday, the day that we were supposed to leave the summit. And then late that night, the winds dropped to 0, and then they rotated around to the northwest, and then ramped up for 2.5 days as the storm exited into the Maritimes. We, on Monday evening, reached 171. So that was the highest wind since 1985, 33 years. Really incredible to be up there for it. We, of course, weren't outside for much of those high winds, but we were in our weather room. We could feel the building vibrating and shaking. The wind on the windows was making them breathe, things I've never seen before. It was incredible being up there. And then you see 171, you're like, I believe 231 could happen up here, once every 150 years or 200 years or so. Really incredible forces coming together to get winds like that. And so with that, we'd love to have some of you up to visit us next winter to see what it's like above tree line. Hopefully not get stranded for a few days, but if that happens, it's pretty exciting. You'd be among a handful of humans that get to experience winds like that on this planet. So I'd love to open up to any questions you might have. Yeah.
Tell us a little about your background.
Sure. My personal background, I studied biology at the University of Maine. I studied environmental studies at Antioch University in New England in Keene, New Hampshire. So my background is environmental education. I have a personal hobby for bird watching, and I've had a lifelong interest in weather. I'm not a meteorologist. Weather observers are often characterized as such, but you do not need to be a meteorologist to be a weather observer on Mount Washington. Typically, the night observers are the chief meteorologists who have a background 4-year college degree in meteorology. But to be a weather observer, you do have to pass the METAR exam, which is administered through National Weather Service. It's a multi-choice exam that is essentially a coding language. METAR is a coding language for all weather phenomenon. So you need to be able to take weather, code it into this language that all pilots and weather observers at airports and elsewhere have to know how to read. And it's really a rigorous exam, and it's kind of designed to try to trip you up. You get 3 chances in your life to take this exam. If you fail 3 times, you're locked out for life from becoming a pilot or a weather observer. So it's really important that you know the METAR code. So all of our observers have to pass the METAR exam within 6 months of being hired. But otherwise, our staff come from a variety of backgrounds: engineering, mathematics, physics, atmospheric sciences as well. But it's not just strict meteorology, for sure. Yes?
How many personnel do you have up on top?
Yep. So each shift, as I said, Wednesday to Wednesday, has 3 weather observers, including, not including, I should say, 2 interns that are usually in a 4-year degree related, again, to atmospheric studies. We also have 2 members of the public for the Summit Volunteer Program. These are folks who are members of Mount Washington Observatory, typically retired folks, spouses or friends, who come up and spend the week with us. They cook the dinner meal for the staff. But it's a very popular program. We get the same folks coming back for years and years. And if taking a trip is something you'd like to do, spending a week on the mountain, you have to do it in the summer before you can do the winter trip. Because in the summer we can get you off the mountain much faster if you feel like it's not for you. So in addition to those folks, we might have some museum staff in the summertime. And on the state park side, there's usually 2 to 3 rangers for New Hampshire State Park Service that are overseeing the mountain itself, because they are physically our landlords and oversee the operations of the mountain. Down in our offices, we have an additional 15 to 20 personnel doing all the boring jobs. Yes?
Is there any understanding why you only reached that 231 miles once?
That's a really good question. I think it probably has something to do with the unique characteristic of the atmosphere at that time. We had a low pressure system which was moving kind of from the ocean into New England, what we would call like a retrograding low. So we had strong southeast winds, our rarest wind direction, which produced the 231 mile an hour event. So they believe it was further funneled up through Pinkham Notch on the southeast side of Mount Washington, which aided in that acceleration effect. But in our 87 years, we've hit 178, we've hit 180, so we haven't broken 200, but we've come somewhat close. Yeah.
How well equipped are you to handle any sort of medical emergencies amongst the team or the staff?
Absolutely. So all of our staff are wilderness first aid certified at least. And on the state park side, we have an EMT. So we do have that basic medical level there of background. But in the winter, this is part of why we do ask any folks that come up, there's kind of an extensive health background check to make sure that folks are comfortable, healthy enough to go up for a couple days or for a week at a time. So we do, have to get a little personal about your health background because you're looking at a minimum of 6 hours if something were to happen to get those personnel up and back down. If there was an incident out on a trail and you were just hiking, you would most likely not be dealing with us. We're really kind of restricted from going out and helping out with search and rescue, but there are professional search and rescue teams through the Forest Service and through the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department that will go out and try to find you. Yeah?
What preventative maintenance do you have so the doors don't get snowed in or iced in? And
Yeah.
You guys can't get out.
All kinds of shoveling and checking of all the doorways. The doors that are typically facing to the north and north and west are all going to be opening in so that we don't have to deal with having to open out into a giant snowdrift. So that there is some amount of precaution there. And then otherwise, it's just constant checking of different doorways, making sure everything, pathways are clear, that sort of thing. Yeah.
What's the precipitation can where it is? Why is it somewhere?
Well, why is the Precip Can where it is? It's in the most exposed and accessible portion of the summit. It's very flat there, and it's kind of equidistant from all the other buildings on the summit. It's essentially in the middle of our parking lot, but it's an open area where, in theory, the most snow and rain could come into the bucket. Sometimes we'll go out there and we'll find a 4-foot drift over the place that we're supposed to get our Precip Can. And those days the National Weather Service understands that, hey, sometimes we can't get our data because the snow does what the snow wants to do. But for the most part, it's pretty accurate as we can make it for the summit with all the winds that we get. Yeah.
The snow accretion that you get on the instruments, I think what the name is, Rime?
Rime, R-I-M-E.
What is the context of that? Is it like as hard as a brick when you have to go out and pull the...
Well, it depends on how long it's been there. If it's fresh, then you can take it and break it right off, and it's crumbly. Of course, it's dry, it's frozen, but it's full of a lot of air pockets. But as it forms closer to the freezing mark, it gets more like glaze ice or freezing rain. That's the worst. When we get that, then crowbars it's tough to get rid of that stuff. Crowbars do very little. So the consistency changes depending on how long it's been there, how many freeze-thaw cycles it's been through, and how close it is to freezing point when it's deposited. Yeah.
For someone to plan a hike up there,
what do you recommend for weather prediction? You mentioned 48 hours. Your prediction is, how reliable is that? Because I hear the weather can change in an instant.
It can, yeah, absolutely change in an instant. But we're the only ones doing that forecast in that area, and it's specifically for areas above 4,500 feet, specifically on Mount Washington. You can take that and extrapolate out to other summits to the north, like the northern presidentials, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, and then south, some of the presidentials, and west over to Franconia or even Moose Lock. But it's tricky because we are specifically kind of right there at the summit. But we understand that weather conditions change rapidly. What you experience at that point on the summit is not what you will experience down even at tree line. So you need to have experience over time of taking these trips. Go with other people that know what they're doing. There are several professional mountain guiding services that bring people up to the summit. This winter, all winters, we actually partner with a number of them, and you can stay overnight. You can hike with a group up, stay overnight with us, and come back down the next morning, get a nice meal, tour the weather station. But for the most part, yeah, follow us online, follow our website. But feel free to reach out to us if you're going on a trip and you're interested in knowing more. We're a great resource. The Appalachian Mountain Club is another great resource. They know the trail system better than anyone else out there. So they're another group to be in touch with before you go. Yeah.
Do you generate your own power, or how does that all work?
We are on grid power. So we are on grid power out of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and the cable is a buried line next to the Cog Railway track. So we are on grid power. If they lose power, we go onto a backup kerosene generator. And we have quite a lot of kerosene stored on the summit should we need it. We have well power, so we have water coming up from a 600-foot dug well, which is pretty incredible. We host our sewage on site. It's actually treated in a specialized Arctic facility on the summit of Mount Washington. But unfortunately, yeah, we can't generate our own power. We'd love to get, wind turbines and solar panels that work in super cloudy and super icy conditions. But it's tough. It's a tough engineering hurdle to get through. So we're working on it. So it is 8. I want to honor that time, but I will stick around for further questions. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much for coming tonight.